Continuing on in our unit of factoring, today we will be factoring quadratic trinomials. So this greatly depends on your ability to figure out greatest common factors and to factor by grouping. So you want to make sure you have those first two lessons down really well because this really builds upon that. All right, so what we're doing is we're going to be having a trinomial, quadratic trinomial like this. So it's x squared is the term. That's what makes it quadratic. There are three different terms. That's why I'm calling it a quadratic trinomial. We will be figuring out what two binomials would multiply together to give us that. Okay, so we have a whole process for doing that. Um, well, this process of breaking down the polynomial into the product of other polynomials is called factoring. And for quadratic trinomials, the factors are linear binomials. So remember the process for multiplying a binomial times a binomial. You distribute the first term, then you distribute the second term, and you combine like terms. And you might heard of the acronym FOIL for that process. So the process of factoring will just be doing the exact opposite. So we're going to go in reverse. So remember the last step is combine like terms. So our first term will be to uncombine them. We break it up. And so then the three terms become four terms. So we would factor by grouping. So we figure out what's the greatest common factor of the first two, what's the greatest common factor of the last two. So that factoring by grouping is just like the undistributing of your first term and undistributing of your second term. And then we factor out that common binomial. So this is just the process of factoring by grouping that we've already done, and you hopefully have practiced that. Okay, so the part that will make you think the most is figuring out how do I break up that 5x term. So remember the last step in FOIL is you combine your like terms. So we do the reverse and we're going to uncombine them. So to figure out how to break up that middle term, we have to take a times c. So 6 times -6, and we place that at the top of our diamond. And then in the bottom, we put that x coefficient, 5. So we have to ask ourselves what two numbers would multiply to -36 and add to 5. So I just start thinking about the factors of 36 with 1 and 36, 2 and 18, 3 and 12, 4 and 9. And then when I get to 4 and 9, I realize, oh, their difference is 5. And so for that to add to +5, I want to have a +9 and a -4, because when I multiply those two numbers together, I get -36. When I add 9 plus -4, I get +5. So the answer to this diamond problem is the answer to how to break up your x terms. Okay, so we take that 5x, we split it up now into a +9x and a -4x. Next, we do our factoring by grouping. So we look at just the first two terms and ask ourselves, what's the GCF? So we're looking at 6x squared plus 9x. If you're thinking their greatest common factor is 3x, you're right. So if I divide both of these terms by 3x, I would get 2x plus 3. Then we move on to the last two, and we ask ourselves, what's their greatest common factor? So I'm looking at -4x minus 6. Now remember, if this is a minus right here, you have to factor out a minus or a negative. So if we have negative here, we have to have negative factor for our GCF. So I'm going to factor out -2. So I'm dividing both of these terms by -2, so that becomes a plus 2x plus 3. So notice that we got 2x plus 3 both times. When we factored out the GCF, that is our common binomial. That's our first factor. And then the 3x minus 2 are our second factor. So this process of factoring by grouping, you've already practiced and you should be pretty good at it. So the part that will make you think the hardest is solving these diamond problems. So how we set up that diamond, just to recap, is at the top, we take a times c. A is the x squared coefficient. C is our constant. And then at the bottom we have b, which is just the x coefficient. We figure out, hey, what two numbers would multiply to the top and add to the bottom? The answer to this is how we split up the x term. So after splitting up the x term, that's when we factor by grouping, which is what we've been doing, and we should hopefully be good at that process of factoring by grouping. All right, so to do that, to number one, to set up our diamond, we multiply 2 times 5, which gives us 10. That's what goes at the top. At the bottom, we put our x coefficient, which is 7. Now we ask ourselves what two numbers multiply to 10 and add to 7. So start thinking about what multiplies to 10. The options are 1 and 10 or 2 and 5. And if you're thinking 2 and 5 add to 7, you're right. So this answer is how we will split up the x term. So I did flip that around from 5 to 2 versus 2 to 5. The good news is these are interchangeable. When you split it up, it does not matter. You can switch the order of these two and you're going to get the same answer. Now we factor by grouping. So we're going to ask ourselves, what's the greatest common factor of those first two terms? Both coefficients are 2, and there's an x to the first power in both of them, so our GCF is 2x. If I divide both of these terms by 2x, I'm going to get x plus 1. Then we move on to the second two and ask ourselves, what is the greatest common factor? So notice they both have a coefficient of 5. So they're both divisible by 5. They don't both have an x, so our GCF is 5. And then if I divide both of those terms by 5, I would get x plus 1. So notice that x plus 1 is our common binomial. That will be our first factor. And then 2x plus 5, those GCFs, make up our second factor. If I distribute the x here, x times 2x gives me 2x squared. That's my first term. Now think about our outside product is 5x. The inside product is 2x. If I combine those, I would get 7x. And then the last term times last term, 1 times 5 would give me 5. So that's checking my answer by distributing. I use that acronym FOIL for that, and I just make sure if I FOIL that, I would get this trinomial that we started with. So to set up our diamond, we were going to multiply a times c, 5 times 6, which is 30, and then we put that x coefficient at the bottom, negative 17. Ask ourselves what multiplies to 30 and adds to negative 17. So I always start by thinking about 1 and 30. That wouldn't work. Next, 2 and 15. Notice that does add to 17. But to add to a negative 17, we want to make them both negative. So negative 2 and negative 15. So the answer to this diamond is telling us how to break up the x term. So now we go from having 3 terms to 4 terms because we split up that x term. When we have 4 terms, we factor by grouping. So we're going to focus on just those first 2 terms and ask ourselves, what's the greatest common factor? So when you look at that, you should be noticing that those terms would both be divisible by 5x. If I divide them both by 5x, I would get x minus 3. Then you move on to your second 2 terms and ask yourself, what's the greatest common factor? Please notice that this is a minus sign right here, so that means you have to factor out a negative. So these are both divisible by 2, but since this is negative, we're going to factor out negative 2. Adding both of those terms by negative 2 would give us x minus 3. So you got the same binomial as you did the first time. That tells you you're doing it right. That's your common binomial. That will be your first factor. And then the greatest common factors go together in your second factor. Multiply 6 times negative 4. Put that at the top of your diamond. Put your x coefficient at the bottom of your diamond. Ask yourself what multiplies to negative 24 and adds to negative 5. That would be negative 8 and positive 3. The answer to this diamond problem is how we split up the x term. So we go from 3 terms to 4 terms. So we will factor by grouping. We focus on those first 2 terms and we ask ourselves, what is their greatest common factor? If you're thinking 2y, you're correct. Divide both terms by 2y, which gives us 3y minus 4. Now move on to the second 2 terms. We've got coefficients of 3 and 4, and the only common factor with 3 and 4 is 1, and they don't both have a y, so the greatest common factor is 1. And this sign is plus, this sign will also be plus, so these are always going to be the same sign here. So sometimes the greatest common factor is only a 1. That's okay. If I divide those both by 1, I get 3y minus 4. So notice we get that same binomial again. That tells you you're doing it right. That's your first factor, the 3y minus 4. And then the 2y plus 1, those are the GCFs. That is our second factor. Multiply 12 times negative 5. That gives you negative 60. Put that at the top of the diamond. At the bottom, we put our x coefficient, 11. And then we think about what multiplies to negative 60 and adds to 11. So for negative 60, I know that to multiply to a negative, I have to have a positive and a negative. So the two numbers that will be here will have opposite signs. So really I'm like thinking about what's the difference between their two absolute values. So 1 and 60 have a difference of 59. 2 and 30 have a difference of 28. So I'm keep going. 3 and 20 have a difference of 17. I'm getting closer. 4 and 15, there's our difference of 11. So to add to positive 11, we have to have negative 4 and positive 15. So that is telling us how to split up our middle term. So we split up that 11c into negative 4c plus 15c. First term stays the same, last term stays the same. We just split up that middle term. So now we go from having 3 terms to having 4 terms, and then we factor by grouping. So focus on those first 2 terms. We ask ourselves, what's their greatest common factor? So 12 and 4 are both divisible by 4, and they both have a c. So our GCF is 4c. If I divide those both by 4c, we would have 3c minus 1. Look at your last 2 terms and ask yourself, what's their greatest common factor? If you're thinking 5, you're right. So divide those both by 5 to get 3c minus 1. Notice we had that 3c minus 1 both times. That's your common binomial. We factor that out. So our factors are 3c minus 1 times 4c plus 5. Thank you for watching the video and taking notes. Please ask questions as needed.